the most attentive audience I've seen in many forums and workshops I've attended over the past couple of years. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm sure you've been probably holding back some good questions. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to come back up to the front here and fire away any questions that you may have. I should remind you also that this forum has been recorded. We will make that available. If there's PowerPoints that you'd like, let us know as well. Obviously, you can log on to our website, metropolitan.fiu.edu. You should be doing that anyways because we have a lot of studies always available on a lot of different topics. But with that, you've stayed here. You've been very attentive. So if there's questions you have, fire away. I think we got most of our speakers left. Mayor.
So I've been trying to understand or come up with a model of who should stay in a high-risk zone and who should leave. And Kevin, you had a slide that really, I think, cuts to the core of this. And it was a slide that showed the potential for upward economic mobility. It's low in South Florida, but disturbingly, it's low throughout the entire Southeast. And there was this sort of band of yellow that sort of moved up through the middle of the country, right up through the Great Plains. And I was surprised to see that band. So what is it about the Southeast that makes it so hard for people to get out of service jobs and into jobs where they can work their way upwards or create businesses? And why is that easier or better to do sort of in the Central Plains states all the way through?
A couple of dynamics. One is historic, and it's been a long history of low-wage industry in the Southeast. It's going back 2 centuries. Some of it also is the success of low-wage industries, tourism throughout the Southeast. So it continues, even though it's very profitable, they're very big businesses. Also shipping, warehousing, they haven't in the past. They are becoming now much more sophisticated and more technologically driven, but historically those have been lower wage, stevedoring and warehousing. So you have it's been a long period of those businesses doing extremely well in the Southeast. The Midwest, I think some of what's been happening in that lighter band you see running up the middle of the country, and you see the spots of lighter out on the West Coast with some of the tech centers and places that have done well. But the band running at the middle is maybe a little more difficult to explain. Agricultural counties have been doing pretty poorly relative to the rest of the country. The places that have been doing really best in the Midwest are those that have taken advantage of the new energy boom. And a lot of those communities, you see, entire new communities that used to be, just destitute are now booming with gas fracking. So energy has transformed the picture of a lot of what's happening throughout the Midwest. Don't know how long that lasts, but yeah, it's one of the two of the issues with income inequality and its persistence, especially in a place like Miami, is you have not just income inequality, but then the ability to move up in jobs. I lived it in Buffalo, and it was, in fact, so persistent that young people had to leave the area. Or, you had to settle way down on the type of work that you did. It was such a difficult issue that a candidate for county executive based his entire platform on keeping kids at home. That, in fact, that was his slogan. Elect me and I'll keep your kids in Buffalo. He won. Hands down. It was that difficult. So a lot of talent leaves. That's devastating to an economy over a long term because that's your next generation of business and innovators and leaders. The other is once you get stuck in a cycle like that, people are they're looking at maps like that and they are choosing to leave, and it's a brain drain. We're some ways in that. We're losing young talent. This area imports a lot of tech talent to fill jobs, but at the same time, it's got a lot of college graduates who are now deciding to leave, and it's because they see the lack of mobility and then housing costs are so high too.
Yes. I've heard a lot, we have all heard a lot about two-point loan backup. There's 2 points to this. There's adaptability and there's mitigation. We've heard a lot about adaptability but the real driver in this is our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which are 410, which they haven't been at in millions of years. What can we do on a local level to address mitigation and not just adaptation?
Wow, we've got a whole bunch of people. Julie, you ready?
Sure. And I can pass this on to others as well. I think this is an issue that we all care about. I do a lot of work specifically on this issue. There's a saying I heard recently that adaptation is the gateway drug to mitigation, right? So we're all thinking about adaptation and pretty entrenched in it here in South Florida. But the fact is, our adaptation measures aren't really going to mean much if we don't cap greenhouse gas emissions and cap climate pollution. There was some talk earlier about how we can be exporting solutions for resilience. We should be exporting solutions for carbon sequestration, for reducing climate pollution. We need to be leaders on this issue locally. And as we're adapting and as we're creating more resilient communities, we need to think about how those communities can also be carbon neutral. We have cities and mayors across the state who have taken the We Are Still In pledge for the Paris Climate Accords. They've committed to 100% renewables. I've talked to a lot of those cities. Many of them don't have a roadmap, a way of getting to their 100% renewables commitment. And there are roadblocks that we're dealing with at the state legislative level, through the PSC, that need to be addressed to really open up those markets and give our communities more options for really investing in renewables and investing in a clean energy economy. After Sandy, there were microgrids, renewable microgrids that really popped up across all the impacted areas in the Northeast. Starting to hear conversations of that. I've had some conversations in Key West about similar projects and the beginning seeds being planted for developing those kind of projects in the Keys. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities for us to really marry our resilience activities with opportunities to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as well.
David, do you want to add to that?
Just from a perspective as not being a U.S. citizen coming in from the other side of the Atlantic, I mean, a couple of things. So we've got an 80% reductions target by 2050 in the UK. We've also got an industrial strategy that's shaped around green industries and green finance. Going green is good business if you're at the head of the curve. If you're at the back of the curve, then you've missed out. So we are shaping our future economy in the UK around sustainable business, around green technologies, and around everything that's going to drive that. And I'm just sort of counterpoint that to the comments earlier from Kevin about the growth in the Midwestern states due to energy. We have now produced, the UK now produces over 50% of its electricity from renewable sources. We have very, very tough legislation. We're going to be phasing out fossil fuel cars by 2030. At the moment here in the US, Ford has just said they're no longer going to produce sedans because actually the profitability on SUVs is bigger. The car, my 10-year-old car that I sold in the UK, I was getting 55 to the gallon. My brand new car I bought here, I get 18. So, this is public awareness and public consciousness. And just in the 4 years that I've been here in South Florida, that has changed 180 degrees. We've gone from legislators being worried about talking to this in case they scare the horses, to legislators being out front in this debate and leading the rest of the country. And that's because the people, their voters are demanding they do it. So that is what's going to change, and that will then lead on to the mitigation.
I laid it out. I mean, I think the county should commit to a really aggressive. I think the 80% by 2050 is admirable, but just too slow. The economics of it are extremely positive by every estimate. I can imagine committing to a carbon neutral county on a very fast basis, and think of the industries tied into it that we're already really strong at that would benefit. I mean, construction, development, some of our transportation and shipping industries would be a huge benefit. It's a major economic question. The other is, I wonder if there isn't also a political reckoning coming for Miami. I mean, Miami's enjoyed this very long party of development. We're still building a whole lot of buildings in very suspect and vulnerable areas. There's going to come a point where we do need assistance from the federal government and the rest of the country in a big way. And I wonder if there's going to be a reckoning that says, well, you know what? You should have been taking care of business. You should have been minding the store. You've got the most to lose, but where are you on mitigation and carbon neutral energy and things that actually solve climate change? That's going to be a difficult sell when Miami raises its hand and says, well, gee, we need disaster relief funding, and people in Ohio say, tough luck.
I'll address the political economy question to our Brookings colleague. Anybody from the Northeast, and my colleagues at the Metro Center have heard this before, if you're from the Northeast, I grew up outside of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has lost a Miami and a half population. Right? It peaked at 2 million. It's now 1.4 million. Okay, the Buffaloes of the world. There was depopulation and deindustrialization. There were shocks to the system that decision makers couldn't ignore. And then you raised San Diego, the Sun Belt. There was defense. So how do the decision makers in Miami? There's always, as Ned says, a crane. There's building. People leave, but people move in. There's nothing. How do the decision makers here? There's no sledgehammer that says we've got to think differently. It's not like Pittsburgh. I'm a hockey fan, and I see on the rink the UPMC, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, is now the biggest employer in Pittsburgh. How do the decision makers here get a kind of branding iron or something that says it's thinking differently, or do they really just get allowed off the hook because there always are more bodies and there's cranes?
Let me preface my answer by saying that I'm not a political economist. I'm just a hack. And what I would offer about it is just based on my experience, probably like Kevin's and others, just sort of looking at cities in American history and what it took for cities to transform themselves. I think that's sort of the nut of your question, right? And I'd say as your question, I think, presages, there are precious few examples of cities and regions that undertook structural transformation that wasn't the result of some catastrophic environmental or economic loss. The magnitude of that catastrophe, varies from region to region. Certainly, San Diego's catastrophe in terms of the consolidation of the defense industry and downturn in spending and base realignment was minor compared to what happened to Buffalo, right? And so that's part of the reason that San Diego made a successful transition, and arguably Buffalo has not, and is still struggling to make it. What's it going to take here? God knows. Probably if you suffered a Category 5 here, and if your city was underwater like New Orleans, maybe you'd do something. Maybe you'd do something different. So it's your choice. I mean, y'all can wait around for that to happen, and then say, okay, now we need a different path. Now that we're facing $200 billion worth of local costs, or you can, I think my only political economy advice to offer, constructive advice to offer, is that more and more it is the private sector that needs to take the leadership on this issue. The public sector is so constrained politically, financially. there just hasn't been a lot. There haven't been a lot of examples in recent American history of the public sector leading transformative change at the local level. Maybe it's not really in our DNA, frankly. It's more in Britain's DNA than it is in our DNA. So I would just counsel keeping your pressure on the business community, which is a very different business community, as Tom's remarks reflected, than it was 40 or 50 years ago. You just can't get 5 guys in a room and make it happen. It's got to be more diverse. It's got to be more broad-based. And it's got to be, yes, private, but also public and civic actors coming together. I think you have some of those ingredients here. But yeah, I think dialing up the level of urgency dramatically is your only chance. Yeah, so good luck.
Michael, this is sort of an ending comment, and hopefully it's something that we're going to discuss next year when we get together. But we say the same thing every time. Okay, we show a lot of statistics, and hey, I'm big into that. I'm a former university professor myself, but what we really haven't come up with is a way to economically show exactly what we do, and so how it will financially benefit everybody. In other words, how can we repay our investment, okay, or how can we pay for our investment and get repaid for it rapidly, and how can we lower our costs and increase our wages? That's what we need to take this information and translate into the next time. So I'm really hoping that when we're sitting here next year, that we have a basic structure for it. And council, I really commend you for at least starting that. So it's really a wonderful. Would you talk to our mayor?
We do, a lot.
Can I make one recommendation for the center? Maybe that I think bringing together these two complementary, but sometimes like parallel strands of the conversation here about the nature of the economy, its ability to produce good paying jobs, and whether the young people of South Florida are getting access to those, and the imperative to undertake mitigation, adaptation to climate change. So there's something here that has the potential to produce new kinds of jobs and industries, and a bunch of people over here who need those jobs in order to increase productivity, wages, and incomes in South Florida. Like what exactly is the potential bridge between those two things? I think it'd be great for researchers and civic leaders in South Florida to investigate that, to look at the some of these economic opportunities that could result from much more active adaptation and mitigation strategies.
So just absorbing a bit of right over here, all the information. One of the things that I notice is that some of the high-lying areas of Miami-Dade are also in some of the poor and distressed areas, such as La Pata, Model City, Little Haiti. So I see an opportunity and also a threat in that there's an opportunity to develop these areas both in education, in I suppose offering better opportunities for housing and for owner-occupied housing for some of the poorer residents. But there's also a threat because if these are high-lying areas that are above the mean of 6 feet, they're 7, 11, 12 feet high, then there's a possibility that developers can see this and start buying out properties and pushing poor people out, and without them having the opportunity to buy in these areas. So is there any talk about this, any talk about the development in these areas?
That's a great question. Is it on? Okay. The issue of environmental gentrification is becoming very topical. It comes up a lot. In fact, the Miami Herald just did an article about displacement, gentrification of businesses in Little Haiti. We've done a study of that area. We knew it was coming. Not only, you mentioned Alapata, East Little Havana, parts of Liberty City. No, it's coming. And I think many of you know, a lot of the poor, distressed neighborhoods in Miami are actually on the coastal ridge. So they are in the higher elevation. So there's going to be more competition and demand for the real estate in these areas. So the question, it always comes back to, and that's why we're here today in many ways, is to talk about community development. Because what's the end goal in community development? It's about who benefits. Who benefits, and I think it was Tom that said it, I think many of our speakers talked about it, it's all about human capital, human development. That's really the ultimate goal of community development. And if we're not thinking about that in terms of who benefits, we're missing the boat. So you're absolutely right. That has to be a real focus on what we do. It's been brought up, I think, by all our speakers. It comes back to people, the residents who live here, who work here, go to school here, raise their kids here. And as you all know, incredible external demand being placed on the limited real estate that we do have between the Atlantic and the Everglades. And it's not just here in Miami, but it's up into Broward and even to Palm Beach. And of course, as Julie said, down in the Keys, it's almost cartoonish down there at this point. So these are really great research questions, and the ones that Alan just raised and others, David and Julie, these are all going to be pieced together as part of Bank United's research in community development, because I don't think I've heard the term holistic used more today. I think I heard it more today than I heard it in the last 20 years. But that is the first term what we use when we talk about community development. Holistic and integrated approaches to community problem solving. So if we can think that way, whether it be in terms of coastal planning, whether it be on sea level rise, whether it be on affordable housing, income inequality, opportunity and inclusion, as long as we're thinking that way, we're going to get there. But it's going to be a challenge, because I think many of you know, and that's a great question, because the dynamics of development that Kevin spoke about in Miami is just it's almost like hyper development, and we're into that. It's slowed down a little bit, but it's certainly at a point where the folks who really need it, the folks who really need to benefit, are not benefiting from that level of development.
Yes, sir. Speaking of folks who really need it, allow me to. When we say resilience, my culture tells it totally different. I'm a woman, so when you talk about resilience, you wait on the mic and you try not to be in your feelings when you get it. However, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Grenier, because you set off a lot of triggers in my head. I'm Madam, maybe it'll be a little bit to tell you who I am. I'm Madam Renita Holmes. I'm the Executive Director of Wave of Women in Public Housing, Education, Finance, and Development. In my efforts for over 37 years of my over 50 years, I'm not telling all the secrets, I have had to have public administration. So I'd like to thank FIU as always for having these type of events that are educational to every level. I live in Overtown, Liberty City. I also run Our Homes Business and Property Services because I'm a subcontractor actually, landscaping, design, CAD, planning, all educational shortcut workshops that I learned or attended through FIU, by the way. But yet I see a lot of other institutions of education, such as FAMU, University of Miami, particularly participate in my community. I'm overly concerned for 37 years of the level of participation of women, African American women head of household, those who are raising young boys who would be the industry workers, those like my father who did not attend college but were landscapers, those like myself now who are just like our dad, know that I'm picking up soil, that I'm working in Poinciana Park, that during the hurricane I had a lot of stuff that my neighborhood, some of it rise that was already there. Knowing that I'm losing my family, my members, and a lot of women who are living in mildew and asbestos. So it's affected us in the inner city. However, as a lobbyist for over 12 years, subject lobbyist, hardly ever paid for what I know, what I experience, and foreseeability when we talk about testing the resilience again, and the disparity in industries. Have never seen quite this type of interaction. Speaks for itself in this room. When everybody leaves, in Miami, the mitigation process for me has been gentrification. I have watched everybody move to high ground. I've watched everyone talk around me. So I have not seen in the city of Miami the interaction of the African American women, or the African American community, the homeowners that are there, because many are leaving. The young ones who talk about don't see green building, although I taught over 47 young men what green building was, who is LEED, what are the requirements, talk about testing soils. We did some other programs on safety and health. And so without taking the time, look at me. When I leave here, I go back to my community of Overtown, Libby City. I take off this suit or this dress coat and I put on boots. I carry an oxygen tank because some of the places I lived in have actually caused me to have respiratory problems. I come to meetings like this without resources, so I have to earn them. Everybody's moving out, my crew, when I talk about my business and property services, because their family can't afford the rent. So everything you've said in here, I can relate and identify to you. But let me tell you why I'm such a great survivor. I have to break this down in Ebonics and take it back to the neighborhood tenant associations. I have to break this down into Ebonics and do proper outreach to young men, service workers, and some in waste and management, by the way. Thank you for sponsoring a great program. Who don't know that some of the places, some of the parks they're cleaning up is not healthy. I have to explain to some of the homeowners and seniors that are still there what you're talking about. I get 2 minutes in the BCC, as you can say. But I'm Toastmasters graduate also, by the way. So when we talk about disparity, we talk about innovation, we talk about holistic, and we speak about actually improving the industries. We talk about involving businesses. You're talking about me. I would like to see the same opportunity for this educational event to be brought a lot closer to the venues in the city and in the inner city community. Thank you, the last person, for asking the question about how they could be more involved. I know I might be taking a little bit more time, but actually, you look at the disparity and the gap of women, head of households that live in the inner city community, in red line mortgage communities where boys need jobs and girls basically are the best STEM participants you can get. There's one thing lacking. These opportunities to dialogue with you, these opportunities to be empowered by education, these opportunities for an educational institute to recruit some of us who already have basic knowledge, not just book learning education in the full process. And for you, Ms. Law, or Ms. Dick, you set it off. It wasn't what I was expecting in my 27 years of attending meetings at the Hyatt Regency. I'm going to ask the women in this room to stick it to them a lot more, to be a lot more of a dick, like the rest of us did, and let them know that this male traditional industry, and I'm not trying to be facetious, I mean, you set it up, really, but as an example, that we can have that type of presence, that we can have that type of input, and that we can have that type of economic justice. I hope FIU will set a series of programs this summertime, because we have another green building program over in Liberty City off MLK, and some will be graduating. We have some of the women planners, architects, veterans, women veterans that were engineers that would like to participate, but they just don't feel like they're invited to the Hyatt, or it's just not accessible. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to tell you that there is a resilient program in the African American and inner city community. We know we're not moving off our good and gracious land because the property value is up. We're willing to fight because some of us have sledgehammers and some of us will whoop you with a rolling pin and a spatula. And we're going to scrape all of this off of your media presentation, sir, and break it down in Ebonics. And if you would be so courteous, be so sincere, and be so innovative about holistic and comprehensive education, we'll look forward to opening up some of our homes and some of our local venues and community centers so that you can have direct application of your expertise and truly practice inclusion and resilience. Thank you so kindly.
Thank you very much. You remind us that all community development is local. The more local we can get, the more effective it is. Thank you. Was it?
So, good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Martinez. I'm with the Miami Downtown Development Authority. So I'm going to maybe give a little bit of the developer perspective on this. We are an independent agency of the city, so I am in the government sector, but our board consists of a lot of developers and real estate folks. I think one of the things that developers look at is, we maybe vilify them a little bit, but they're not necessarily looking for the higher ground today. That's just, those neighborhoods tend to be in the path of development. So it's kind of, there's maybe multiple factors going on there in terms of why they would target certain areas. What I would suggest is to look at, and I would ask the question of the panel is, what's the government example that we're getting? So when I look at this downtown, and I say, the city of Miami has real estate assets in this downtown. Miami-Dade County has assets in this downtown. The school board has assets in this downtown. Miami-Dade College has assets in this downtown. And when they look to capitalize on those assets, they do the exact same thing that the private sector would do. They build a project with a private developer to do condo or high market conventional rental, or to do hotel, And what signal does that send to the private sector? If the concern is that we do holistic development across this community, and you take your own real estate assets and you do the things with them that a private developer would otherwise do, and then you turn around and say, but I want to regulate you to do differently with your property, I don't understand the incongruity of that perspective. So if any on the panel, and I think Alan, given that you have kind of a broader perspective on the kind of the world, give us some perspective on that as well, just because I don't know if from the private sector side, the way the conversation moves forward is necessarily making sense. So thank you.
I'm looking to hand the baton to somebody.
Sure, I can address some of the questions there. I think the private sector can do a lot. Through one of my clients, we recently did some polling on renewable energy in Florida, and people expect the private sector to lead, not the government, on that issue, and they have. I mean, in other states, you see the demand from private companies coming in and saying, we have a 100% renewable commitment, and we need you to build the infrastructure to help us make that. And that's leading the way in really transforming the electric grids in other cities. The private sector has the power and the ability to do that. Years ago, we had much stronger concurrency in the state of Florida. I think we need to start looking at that again. But that means if a private developer comes in, they have to pay for the infrastructure that goes along with the increased demands on the system. So our transportation system, our schools, everything else, that needs to be part of a holistic picture in terms of how development is happening and the role that the private sector and developers are playing in this community. As we're dealing with sea level rise, that concurrency money seems to be more important. That planning that comes with private development is more important than it ever was. And we really do need the private sector to lead on that and to be pushing our local government so they can lead. Unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of leadership on resilience or sustainability from the school board. I think they're looking to do that. They've made some statements, but it's kind of scary. But that's where the private sector, if you're a developer coming in and building a high-rise in Miami where there's going to be adding, hundreds of new units, you need the schools to go with that, and we need the resilient infrastructure that's going to allow people to get around to go along with that.
There was a lot of sprawl development, of course, that took place in South Florida through the 80s and 90s, even into the last decade. There was a movement back in the 90s, some of you may remember, it was called Eastwood Ho. You remember that? Eastwood Ho. It was all about, back in the 90s, focusing on the communities basically east of I-95 and not going back towards the Everglades or where we are right now. So much happened. We devalued land in many ways because we began to think about all that land out west that was easy. It was easy to develop. Just keep extending the water lines, extending the sewer lines, one development after another. And we ignored basically the east where we lost so many of our jobs. Wynwood itself lost almost 20,000 jobs in a matter of 15 years. It's come back, but it's not come back to the Wynwood that it once was, a working class community. So we've kind of allowed the development pattern to occur in South Florida, particularly here in Miami-Dade and Broward, moving west and moving southwest, allowing that to happen, and in many ways not really appreciating what was here. If it could have been a more compact level of development that kind of focused in on the assets that were already in place, the ways that we could have complemented that and brought in mixed income housing at the time. Remember, housing affordability was not an issue in South Florida until about 2004-05. You could buy, in fact, that's what they talked about all the time in terms of South Florida. The dirt was cheap. The dirt was cheap, the land was cheap, property was cheap. That all changed, of course, in 2004 and 2005, and of course ever since. We had this incredible opportunity back in the 90s and prior to that to really do the level of infill development that could have complemented all those assets you're talking about, and at the same time providing the necessary mix of housing that could have then supported the jobs that were in the downtown area and along the I-95 corridor, but we missed the boat. Now we're having to come back to it again. But unfortunately, a lot of the development we're seeing now is not for the folks who live in the communities of Liberty City or Little Haiti or Alapata or Overtown. Is a whole new external demand. So we had that opportunity, we blew it. We blew it big time. But now maybe there's an opportunity here. If there is this rethinking about community development and what that means for every city within Miami-Dade County, all 36 or 7, how many there are, a lot of them along the I-95 corridor, getting back to some of the points that were made this morning, every community has got to kind of step up to the plate. You know, what does resiliency mean to you? What is economic resiliency? What does community development mean to you? We can't rely on Tallahassee. We can't rely on Washington, D.C. We really can't rely on the county. But each municipality can do something of its own. And certainly that's the focus of the community development agenda going forward. So, yeah, I mean, you raised some really good points there. Maybe one more question? Or? Okay. Do we have time for one more?
Yes, can I just take one more?
A closing remark? I'm sorry, the what?
Here's a question.
Maui?
I'm seeing the best way to say this. I kind of learned over time that the things that used to make you happy will make you sad in the end. And I say that because we talked a lot about economic sustainability. And tourism has made South Florida happy for a very long time. And it seems like because of tourism, it creates this low-wage job situation, which is now starting to make us sad. So at what point, I know this is a very dangerous question for like our politicians and stuff, at what point will South Florida start to move their focus away from tourism and start moving that focus back into their locals, their local economy, that particular infrastructure, moving away from, you know, the snowbirds, sorry if there are any in here, but moving away from that particular like development and things of that particular nature and shift it back into like the local economy?
Well, it's a great question. I'm going to refer both to, because both Alan and Kevin have spoke to it to some extent, and I'll let both of them, and then we'll wrap it up after that and call it another annual event.
I mean, that's the real question, isn't it? Tourism has been so successful in South Florida, so successful in Miami. I mean, 8 firms in the cruise industry, the amount that they contribute to the South is phenomenal. I mean, and the amount that they've grown. It's hard to argue with success. I don't think, unless the climate changes so drastically and tourists finally decide that, you know, it's too much of a risk to buy a plane ticket because a storm will wipe out my vacation. And you know what? Phoenix is looking a lot better these days. Unless the climate really changes our tourism industry that much, we're going to continue to drive there's going to be a tourism industry that thrives here. The question is not abandoning tourism. I mean, that's suicidal. You know, why shoot yourself in the foot? The question is, you know, like I'm trying to say is, what's the way that we raise the quality of jobs, just like Alan's talking about, in parallel with that? And then there's also some talk about, well, how do you improve the quality of jobs within industries like tourism and lower wage? It's interesting what's happening in actually warehousing. And Miami's quickly becoming a leader in automated and robotic warehousing. So all of a sudden the jobs that you're seeing, and you're seeing it in actually in Doral, which used to have I do a lot of remodeling on my house. So I spend a lot of time in the tile district in Doral, a lot of time. And I've watched it over 8 years change from these showrooms with huge warehouse spaces now to this really efficient system. Small showrooms, just having a few tiles on display that you need, and you go someplace else to a big consolidated warehouse that now has 7 to 10 companies in it. They're learning how to make. That's a great example of how jobs, skills, and now there are people, you know, I mean, basically developing software and sitting at a keyboard all day as a key part of warehousing distribution, where they used to either be, you know, driving a lift or pulling stuff off of shelves. Great example of upgrading within an industry. So if tourism can start to do that in some way, and I believe that it could, and so I say, you know, the question is what does tourism look like in a post-climate change world? And maybe it's even more interesting. I don't know. It could be a whole different set of tourist activities and experiences that aren't being offered now but are offered in the future. That's the way to talk about tourism on that track. But I really think it's critical that you look in terms of those other good paying, more equitable, high skilled, high knowledge industries. How do we raise them in parallel with the other stuff that we do very well? But how do you raise that in parallel? And you've hit it. That's really the question.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank our speakers, Alan Berube, Maria Ursula, Kevin Greinhead, Julie Dick, Dave Koger, Tiffany's gone, Tom, Bank United, our sponsor, Waste Management. Thank you all so much. Once again, it's been recorded. A lot of the information is available on our website as well. And thank you so much for coming. We'll see you again next year. Thank you so much.
Produced by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.